All right, so yes, I'm going to start with the earlier history, just to make sure. Some of you may have done this before, and you may know about the early history of the British Isles, but I suspect that quite a lot of you don't have very much idea about this. So I'm dividing it into two basic periods. The first period we'll look at now is up until the year 1066. That might sound like a random number, but I'll explain later on why 1066. And we're going to be talking about people called Celts, we'll be talking about the Romans, the Anglo-Saxons, the Vikings, and finally a group of people called the Normans. So what we've got is the colonization of Europe. How did its present population arise? It was colonized basically from the east by waves of people who are known as Indo-Europeans. And their languages and cultures go back to a common origin in the area that we call the Ukraine. You can see the British Isles here, and we've got the rest of Europe. We've got an area very much in the east of Europe, or possibly even sort of more over towards what we would think of as Russia today. And that's the area that these people came from. Okay, the Ukraine. So you've got something like this. You can see that they also went down into Asia, into India, and the origins of those populations, or many of the people in those areas, is also the same cultural origin. These people are, it's called Indo-European culture, and Indo-European, very important as a language group. And if I focus on the European side of it, okay, just that area, we can see a series of different groups of migrations that took place, roughly 5,000 years ago. Some of them more recent, some of them more ancient, and they involved a range of different peoples. Got the Scandinavians or Viking people up there in the north. We've got the Celtic or Gaelic people over here in the British Isles. You've got the Germanic or Teutonic peoples over here in what is now, of course, Germany. We've got the Latin or Roman people. The Greeks down there in the right-hand corner there, or also known as Hellenic peoples. And finally, we've got the Iberian Celts, the Spanish people, down in this corner. The Iberian Celts would be similar in type to the Celtic or Gaelic people, but influenced by slightly different. You can see they branched off from each other a few thousand years ago. These people form an important cultural identity. Their languages share the same roots. Japanese is a language that's very isolated from other languages. There's nothing that's very similar to Japanese. But these languages all fall into a big group called Indo-European, and inside that big group there are smaller groups, so that Latin is similar to Spanish, Italian, French today, the Germanic languages, English is a Germanic language, and so on. So they all kind of have a connection with each other. So there's a cultural and linguistic connection between these different groups of Indo-European people. So that's the bigger picture on Britain itself. Well, when the Romans arrived in Britain, which would be 55 BC when they first got there, okay, they found these different people. It's basically a Celtic country, but they found the Brythonic or Brittonic Celts, we can also call them the ancient Britons. Okay, they found these people living in basically this kind of area, which is quite close to what we think of as, what constitutes England today and Wales today. It's not exactly the same border at the north there, but it's roughly similar. Over here in Ireland, there was another group of Celtic people called the Gaelic Celts, or the Goidelic or Gaelic Celts. And the Romans didn't really get very much into contact with them. They're a bit too remote. And then the Scots, the Picts, as they were called in those days, were possibly Celtic or possibly not. I think that the usual consensus today is that they were Celtic people, but there's some debate about whether they were Celtic or not. But this would be the population of Britain before the Anglo-Saxons 2,000 years ago. All right, we'd more or less be looking at that kind of makeup of population. And so that's what the Romans would have found when they arrived. They first arrived in 55 BC, led by Julius Caesar, and there were these three Celtic groups. And the area that the Romans took control of was basically this area occupied by the Brythonic Celts, this area marked in kind of red here on the map. So Roman Britain never really extended into Scotland. It never really extended into Ireland. It was mostly in this area. And the Romans were in control in that area for hundreds of years. They left around 410 AD, so several hundred years later, and really not all that much had changed since the time they first arrived. The main Roman influences were on the road system. Some of the roads that the Romans built are still used today. Okay, the main motorways, the A1, for example, which goes from London to Edinburgh, that road was basically built by the Romans. The city of London itself was founded by the Romans, along with some other cities that are still occupied today. And the Christian religion. The Romans, when they first arrived in Britain, of course, they arrived before Christianity started, and for the first couple of hundred years or so, the Romans were not Christians. But slowly, the Romans adapted to Christianity. Okay? Now, if anybody's having difficulty seeing the screen, please feel free to move a little bit further forward or come and sit where you're okay. Can people see comfortably enough? I'll make a little break for people who want to move. Okay? Here's at least one. All right? I tried to make the print reasonably large, but it might be a bit difficult for some people. Okay, anybody else? Yeah, please. Yeah. Okay. You will, of course, be able to see this again when I put it up on the website with my narration, so you can check things if you can't catch them in class. But it's probably good if you can see as much as possible of the screen while I'm making the presentation. Okay, then, so that would be, 1,000 years or more before the period that we're going to be focusing on. But it's important to notice that this was the country at that stage. There were no English at this time. There was no England. That came later. That comes after the Romans. So let's move on a little bit and look at the situation there. So you can see Roman Britain just sort of went up to this line across the country here. They built a wall across the country at that point because it was the narrowest point, and that defined what was the Roman area. So you can see that what is now Scotland and what is now Ireland was not part of Roman Britain. Okay. You can also see here the cities that they founded and the roads that they built. And as I say, many of those cities are still centres of habitation. Many of those roads are still there, still being used today. One of the reasons for that would be that the local people would make a road that went round other people's property. The Romans didn't care whose property it was, they just went straight there. So the Roman roads just go absolutely straight, mile after mile after mile, all through the countryside. So very convenient for modern motorways and that sort of thing. So let's move on a bit then to the fall of Rome in 410 AD, the slow dispersal of the Roman people who left. There had never been a huge amount of Roman people living in Britain. For them it was a cold and miserable place that they were sent to where they had to do their duty. So I suppose that many of them were happy enough to leave. After they left, as I say, they didn't leave all that many influences behind, and the spread of the people was fairly much as it had been with Picts, Gaels and Britons, all of whom were speaking different kinds of Celtic language. We'll come back and talk about language a little bit later on, but these were the people that were left after the Romans. And sorry, I've gone back. I seem to be going backwards here. Okay, yeah, here we go. The Angles, Saxons and Jutes, three different tribes of people moving in from the Germanic area, Germanic peoples. Basically, what had happened was that after Rome fell, there was nobody to protect these islands. And so, looking to expand their territory, the Angles, the Saxons and the Jutes, who were Germanic tribes, Teutonic peoples, they moved in over the lands, mostly the lands of the ancient Britons in the south here. A lot of the Britons who stayed were forced into slavery or servitude of one kind or another, and others moved westwards into Wales here, or they left Britain altogether at that time. So the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes, they became the dominant people in that area. And this was the beginning of England. England is Angle land, the land of the Angles, the land of these Germanic people who moved in after the Romans left. In the 5th century, the 6th century, these people moved in. And they spoke a language called Anglo-Saxon. I mean, when they first arrived, the Angles and the Saxons were speaking slightly different languages, but the languages sort of both in the same group and very similar languages, and they sort of mixed together and became something called Anglo-Saxon. And we also call Anglo-Saxon Old English. Technically, Anglo-Saxon is called Old English. People say Shakespeare spoke Old English, but he didn't. Right? His English is early modern English. Old English is a different language. You wouldn't understand it. Okay? It's a different language from our language that we speak today. Sounds more like German. And yeah, they started arriving around about the middle of the 5th century. and over a period of about 100 years, they established 7 different kingdoms. It wasn't one united country. It hadn't been a united country under the ancient Britons either. It had been small kingdoms, small countries. And basically, 7 countries developed during the period after the Romans left that were controlled by the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. It's not terribly important to us at this stage what those countries were or the details, but this is the beginnings of the country that we call England. You can see it was rather smaller than we see England today, and it does not include this area here, which is Wales. Okay, so another thing that you might want to look at here is these red dots, which are showing mountainous areas. This is basically the green and pleasant land, all right, the pasture land. These people were cattle farmers, these Germanic people. They took this land because it was great for keeping their cows. And the Celtic peoples were pushed into the more mountainous areas here and here. These more mountainous areas mostly remained in control by the ancient Britons or the Celtic people of one kind or another. And of course Ireland. The Anglo-Saxons never got as far as Ireland. Okay, yeah, looking at it again, you can see this would be their area, the Anglo-Saxon area, and most of the mountainous areas would be Celtic. So another way of looking at that is they took the best land for themselves and left the rest for the Celts. So we got these different kingdoms. As I said, there were 7 basic kingdoms established. We don't need to go into too much detail about them. But is it perhaps useful to note that it wasn't a single country and it was divided into these little kingdoms. The Celtic countries as well were divided into smaller kingdoms. They weren't one united country. So Britain at the beginning of the 9th century would look something like this, with the Celtic kingdoms in Scotland and Ireland and Wales, and the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms over here. But there's something else that we need to pull into the picture around about this time, the 9th century. By this time, there's another group of people who've become kind of influential because they also were looking to expand their territory, and these people would be the Vikings. These new arrivals, we can see these northern territories here, which were Norwegian. We can see this little area here, which is called the Danelaw, coming from Denmark, the Danish Vikings. So the Vikings were moving into the north of Scotland. They were also kind of later on invading other parts of Britain and Ireland, but they're starting in the east because, of course, that's where they're coming from. So they start to establish control around here and around here. So you've got this other group of people called the Vikings who are coming in. And this Danelaw area expands as the Vikings come in. We get Vikings here in Scotland. We get Vikings over in Ireland, not showing up terribly well on the map there, but over in Ireland. And we got the Danelaw spreading across England. So you've actually got parts of Anglo-Saxon England that were controlled by Viking people. During the 9th and 10th century, the Vikings established control much more extensively and really challenged the Anglo-Saxon people very strongly. So the Danelaw, at the height of its power, you can see how extensive the Danelaw was. It really covered a huge area here of England. So the Viking people would have to be considered as an important part of the history of the English people. Okay. And then finally, for this first presentation, the Norman invasion. And this is why I chose the year 1066, because the Normans invaded in that year. Now, the Anglo-Saxon people got together during the 9th century to defend themselves against the Vikings. And there's only one king of England who's ever called the Great, and that's King Alfred. And he ruled in the later part of the 9th century. And he saved the country basically from being entirely under Viking rule. But the Vikings continued to be quite important, and there were 3 Danish kings in the early 11th century. There were 3 Danish kings of England. So the country was starting to become united, but the king was not necessarily always an Anglo-Saxon, but quite often a Viking. And then, as I say, 1066, the turning point for English history. You've got the Saxon king Harold. Finally, they've got a Saxon king, and he's only just begun to be the king of England when the country is invaded by Vikings from the north of in the north of England, and he leads an army and he beats them. But by bad luck, or possibly by skillful timing, another group of people called the Normans attacked in the south. Harold's army was exhausted. They'd travelled all the way up from the south of England to the north of England. They'd fought a large army and they had won. But now there was another attack in the south, and they had no chance. By the time they marched south, they were exhausted and they could not fight off the Normans. Now, the Normans were French-speaking people coming from a part of France called Normandy. Still today it's called Normandy. But although they spoke the French language, they were genetically originally Vikings. They had moved down from Scandinavia a couple of hundred years before, and they had made their own society in France, and they were by now French-speaking. So this would be the end of Anglo-Saxon England, and it would be the beginning of a new period with the Anglo-Saxon people now under the control of the Norman people. All right, so this is, roughly speaking, the very early history of England and Britain. All right. Just to go into the history of the Battle of Hastings, very, very famous. You're looking at 200 kilometers here, so the total distance here would be, what, about 300, I suppose. What have we got? The army moving north, okay, on September the 25th, fighting a battle against the Vikings in the north, and then having to move south again, and in October, just a couple of months later, trying to fight a big battle against the Normans who've come in from Normandy in the north of France, and this time it's just impossible. They can't hope to beat this fresh army when they themselves are exhausted. So the Battle of Hastings is the turning point in English history. The Saxon king was killed. Lots of his leaders, lots of the other leaders of the Saxons had been killed at that time. at Stamford Bridge in the north of England, and there was nobody else to replace Harold as the leader after he was killed, so basically the Normans won the battle. The leader of the Normans was a man called William, who then became called William the Conqueror. He was also known as William the Bastard, in the sense that he was William whose parents were not married. Okay, he was an upstart. He had taken power, but legally, since his parents weren't married, legally in the laws of those times, he had no right to power. But he was a powerful person, and he took power in spite of the circumstances of his birth. So from now on, the Saxons were going to be the second-class citizens, and they were going to be under the power of the Normans. And this is going to be tremendously important in understanding English history, how we've got these three groups of people: Celtic people in Scotland, Ireland, and Wales, Anglo-Saxon people in England, and then as the ruling class of the English people, the Normans. All right, that's the kind of starting point that we need to have a grasp of in order to understand anything that comes afterwards. All right, so I'm going to finish this section here. We'll take a short break. We've got these different ethnic, linguistic, cultural groups, and England is very distinct from the Celtic people, who were there much earlier on and spoke a completely different language, still do speak a different language. Although everybody speaks English, those Celtic languages still continue. Christianity would be one of the contact points. The Anglo-Saxon people, when they arrived, weren't Christians, but they were Christianized partly through Christian evangelists coming from Rome to spread the Christian religion, but also because the Celtic people had already been converted to Christianity under the Roman rule. So Christianity would be one of the points that they had in common with their Celtic neighbours. And then that's where I'm going to take a short break now. After a few minutes to think about all of that, we'll move on and look at the later medieval period after 1066 and up until the beginning of the period that we're going to be focusing on in this course.